Hey everybody, welcome back to the next part in my Creating a Great Tone series. And this is a series I've had going for a long time. I've covered a lot of topics in it, so I don't do a large number of videos in this series, but there is one that I've been wanting to do for quite some time. And that is just generally talking about the best practices for making sure that our Line 6 Helix is set up properly for the particular situation that we are using it in. The Helix is an extremely powerful tool, and I think the folks at Line 6 did an amazing job in designing it in a way that it was not just a one-trick pony, let's call it. We can use it by itself, we can use it in conjunction with amplifiers, we can use it in just about any imaginable way, and this is a great thing. But along with that comes the possibility of maybe setting it up in a way that would not allow us to get the most out of it in a particular situation. So today I wanted to take you through what I feel are some of the most common scenarios that the Helix is used and talk about some of the finer details of fine-tuning it so that we can get the most out of it and make sure we're kind of getting the optimal settings for it so that things are going to sound as good as they can. Now, the reason I bring this up is I've made many presets over the years, a lot of free ones on custom tones, some paid premium presets that I have up on Line 6 Marketplace, and for the most part, the feedback has been excellent, but every now and then I'll get a comment or an email or a private message on some medium to tell me that, you know, it doesn't sound like it does in your video. It doesn't sound the same. Now, I've done videos about this in the past, you know, it depends on what guitar we're using. It depends on our monitoring system. There are so many variables, right? It even depends on the player and how the player plays. There's so many variables to how that finished preset is going to sound. The room you're in, the speakers you're playing through, as I said, just endless variables here. So it's not a surprise that things are going to sound a little bit different when you're using it at home. And I've actually included with my Line 6 Marketplace presets a handy little PDF manual which actually guides you through some of the things you can do to really make things work for yourself in a very simple fashion. So that comes along with all my Line 6 Marketplace presets. Here is the big thing. That's the situation I just talked about where there's like differences because of monitoring and room and whatnot. It's not really what this video is about. This is about the possibility of even just having a preset being used in an incorrect scenario, let's call it, okay? And we'll get into these scenarios in a second. So we want to make sure we are using a preset as it was designed, number one, and with the proper settings on our Helix. Okay, so the first thing I want to dive into before we dive into these different scenarios we can use our Helix in, and like I said, what I feel are the more popular ones, I want to show you some settings on the global settings that can really be massively important to getting the most out of our Helix. So I'm going to take you down onto the floor under my desk where my Helix resides, and we're going to take a look at some global settings. All right, so here I am down on the floor, literally by my Helix. What we want to do, we see that we're on our normal kind of preset screen here. So if we go up to our little hamburger button here, and I hope this is clear. I know the lighting isn't great under here, but hopefully this is all clear. We're going to press that, which takes us into our menu, and over here, we have global settings. So I'm going to click global settings, and we can take our little joystick here and we can move around to these different global settings. But the one we're interested in right now are the ins and outs. And we want to take a look what's going on here. We have this ability to have a guitar in pad, which is going to just cut back on the amount of signal. Let's say we have a really hot pickup, or maybe some people even use this with active pickups with the main guitar input. There's also an aux input on the back of the Helix, which is designed more for active pickups, but some people I know have used the main guitar input with this guitar pad on, and it just cuts the signal. So what's going to happen if you put that on with any pickup, you're going to notice the amount of overdrive distortion that you get goes down a bit because you're not hitting the front end of the amplifier as hard. So it's going to be up to you. I've heard some people say that they like the sound better with the guitar in pad on, and I've done it in the past. Now I tend to keep it off. It works fine that way, but that's going to be up to your own personal preference. Then we go on to phantom power for the microphone in. We're not really talking today about using the XLR. I have a whole other series, Line 6 Helix, in the studio that talks about that. So we can just kind of skip over here to page over, and I'm going to hit that button. We go to a whole other page of ins and outs global settings, right? And we can see that we have here quarter-inch outputs, XLR outputs, send, return 1, send, return 2, send, return 3, send, return 4. Lots of possibilities here, lots of options. But this is where I really want people to be aware of the right settings. The different scenarios we're going to talk about today are going to require whatever outputs we're using to be on the correct setting here for optimal results. So our choices on the quarter-inch inputs are either instrument or line. Okay, so if we're sending the quarter-inch outputs to a destination that wants to see an instrument input, it's very important to have this set to instrument so it's sending the right signal level out to that output. If it's going to a destination that wants to see line, then we want to set this to line. On the XLR outputs, we have two choices. We have mic and we have line. So if we're using our XLR outs, depending on where we're sending that to, again, we're going to want to set those appropriately. Now, it also same applies for our sends and our returns. We want to have those set appropriately. Basically, those are the settings I want us to all be aware of, and I think those are going to be rather important to, like I said, getting optimal settings out of the Helix so we get the best desired results. All right, so now that we understand where and how we can set our different outputs to different settings, we can now talk about what I feel, and again, I could even be missing some here, and I very likely am. This was not a video that's going to exhaust all possibilities, because that's almost impossible. Just when you think you know all the scenarios somebody's going to use a Helix in, there's going to be another one that comes along you never thought of or never needed, right? But I'm going to go with what I feel are the most common. So we're going to look at the use of the Helix and setting up properly when used with FRFR studio monitors and in some various situations with real amplifiers as well. Okay, so number one is using it with an FRFR or studio monitors. Studio monitors and most FRFRs I've ever come across want to receive a line level signal. So whatever outputs we're using out of the Helix, whether it be the XLRs, whether it be the quarter-inch, and that's sometimes going to be dependent on what kind of connectors you have for your monitors or your FRFR. We want to set that output to line, and that's a very important thing. And I suspect that could be an issue why some folks get less than perfect results and scratch their head sometimes as to why things aren't sounding exactly as they want them to. So we'll set that to line. Now let's go over to HX Edit for a second, and we'll take a look at a very kind of typical setup. I'm using my template that I use all the time here, and I have an amp and a cab set up. Now this is important because not all setups and scenarios we're going to talk about are going to require an amp and a cab, and that's another problem that I think causes some folks some issues, which we'll get to when we talk about the use with the real guitar amps. So I have an amp and a cab. This is, a model and simulation of the real amplifier, preamp, power amp section feeding into, an impulse response style speaker cabinet. With these on the Helix, we have some control over the microphones and whatnot. I'm not really doing any playing today, so it doesn't matter about the settings here. But we're feeding it into a cab because we're trying to mimic the end result of a real guitar rig. Plugging into a guitar amp, going through the preamp and power amp section of that, feeding into a speaker cabinet, and getting those results back out. And obviously on the Helix, we can add all sorts of other things. But this is a very typical scenario where we're trying to make our studio monitors or our FRFR sound like a real mic'd up guitar in the studio, right? So that's really how this setting is going to be. Very simple, very straight ahead. But the most important thing for this is, like I said, make sure whatever outputs you're using are set to line level so the speakers are receiving the desired output that they expect to receive. Okay, so number two is a topic now using real amps in something called 4-cable method, or you'll see people shorten it to 4CM. I've done an in-depth video about that in the past, and I will link to it. Hopefully it'll pop up on the screen if I remember to do that. As you're watching this, if you want to go check that out and get a little more in-depth with it. But again, 4-cable method basically is this. We're going to be using the Helix in conjunction with a real guitar amplifier. But it goes a little more in depth than that. Sometimes we want certain effects to be before the amp or hitting the guitar input, and sometimes we want certain effects that just sound and work better in the guitar effects loop. And that's what 4-cable method does. We basically plug our guitar into the Helix and the normal guitar in. We take a feed out of it into the input of whatever amplifier of choice we're using. We then take the send of the effects loop and return it on a return of the helix. And then we send one of the sends back out of the helix into the return of the effects loop. I hope that was clear. But like I said, I have an in-depth video about that. But again, the most important part here to remember would be setting those settings we talked about in global on the outputs and the inputs in this case to the appropriate setting. So what we have then is, if we think about a guitar amp, the guitar input on an amplifier is designed to see an instrument level signal. That's just by its nature the way it's designed. So whatever output we're using to send the signal to the guitar input, we have to set that to instrument. We don't have to, but it's going to give you very different results if you don't. If you send a line level signal there, you're going to notice that you're going to have a lot more output hitting it. It's going to distort that output. And that, I feel, sometimes is the reason why some folks get it and go, whoa, this is not what I expected and it doesn't sound right. So simply setting that to an instrument level is very important. Coming through that path then, depending on the effects loop of the amp, and this is the other thing, we really, there's so many different amp designers out there, but for the most part, I'm going to go with what's most common. Once we go through that preamp section, the send that we're sending back in is going to be more of a line level signal. So we would want to send our send out of our effects loop of our amp to the return on the helix and set that to line level. Then we would want to send our send out of our helix back into the return on the amp and set that to line level as well. And that is what's going to give us sort of our optimal signal flow, let's call it, okay? Now, coming back over to HX Edit, if I was to take this and use it as a 4-cable method, we're not going to get great results. It's not set up like that. In fact, in 4-cable method, we're using a real amplifier. So presumably, we want the sound of the preamp and power amp of the amplifier that we're using. We don't need an amp block. We don't need a cabinet. We've got a real guitar cabinet. We want to get rid of that and set this up in a way that's going to work for 4-cable method. Again, I don't want to get into detail here. I have that video. Go watch it. It'll give you all the details you need for setting up 4-cable method. But if we are putting an amp or cab in that chain, unless we're trying to do something really crazy, it's really not needed for pure 4-cable method. Okay, number 3 is using a real amp, but going straight into the guitar input, not messing with the guitar amplifier effects loop at all. Now, this would be kind of using the Helix as a pedal board, sort of the old style of doing this and plugging it straight into the front of an amp and going for it. Now, there are certain effects, delays, reverbs that sound better, and I'll say better because who really decides what better is, right? When they're after distortion. But some folks like to put, say, a spring reverb before the amp, before distortion, to get really wild effects. So there's no right or wrong here. I'm just kind of going with the most common, let's call it, scenarios. So what we would do in that case is set the Helix up at, quite simply, if I come over here, start a new preset, say, okay, I've got this blank slate. My guitar is coming into this. I'm going out my output. Now, we would want the output that we are sending, which is likely going to be a 1/4 inch output, going into the front of amp set to instrument. Again, that front of the amp, as we've mentioned already, is expecting to see an instrument level input. Okay, so we want that set there for optimal results again. And then we can just come in here and decide I'm going to, add whatever. I'm going to add a Minotaur. I'm going to put some chorus, after that. I'm going to put a little bit of reverb. Let's go to the legacy ones and grab a plate reverb. And in between there, I'm going to slap in a delay. That would be kind of a pedal board setup. We have the output set to instrument level. We plug that straight into our amplifier. No need for cab blocks, no need for amp blocks, because we again are using a real amplifier. And the last way I wanted to talk about is the power amp in kind of model. Now, some amplifiers have a totally separate power amp input, which bypasses the preamp, oftentimes bypasses the tone stack EQ on the amplifier, the real amplifier, and we can just access the power amp. Now, not all amps have that. Some amps have effects loops, send, return, right? So the return on that, oftentimes, again, depending on how the amp was designed, will act similar to a power amp input. So other than using a dedicated power amp input, we could just access that through the return. Now, Again, on the output setting of that, at this point, we would want to use a line level, okay? This part in the chain of the amp has already come after the preamp section, right? So it's already expecting a boosted signal, which is what the line level is going to give us. So we set that to line. Coming back over to HX Edit though, what would this look like as far as a preset goes? Well, we can have all the effects and everything else. Really what we're doing is we still very likely want to use a guitar amp model. Now, this will be open to some discussion and probably some folks will weigh in here with their views about it. And there's really no right or wrong again. The amp models, if I come and throw an amp model on with no cab, whatever I might choose, let's grab a Brit Trem Norm. This is modeling the preamp and power amp section of that amplifier, which is going to have very specific characteristics. Some folks will say, well, if we're already accessing the power amp in of a real guitar amp, we don't really need to power amp the power amp, or grab the power amp characteristics of this model and put it into the power amp characteristics of the amp we're using. And that's very logical and is very true. Will it work? Absolutely. Will it change the tone slightly? Yeah, probably. It's going to be up to us to determine what's right for us. So you could go with a full-blown amp model, or you could come down to preamps, which are the same models. And what did I grab here? What did I grab? The Brit Trem Norm, I think. So this is now just the modeled preamp section of this same amplifier without the power amp characteristics. So we would be relying on this preamp model to get the characteristics of that amp and then use it with the characteristics of our guitar amp, power amp. Does that make sense? I hope. Right? Now, some folks might be running not through a tube amp. Maybe they're using something like one of the Power Stage series power amps from Seymour Duncan, or a similar product, and they may want the tube modeled characteristics of the full amplifier. So that's really neither here nor there. I'm going to always say, as I do, that everybody has an opinion. You know, all of them matter and none of them matter, including my own, because it really just depends. It's nice to hear somebody's opinion. You go, oh, I never thought of that. That's great. But in the end, we have to decide what sounds best for us and what's going to work best, right? So those are our options, right? And then from there, we don't have a need for a guitar cab because we are going into that power amp input of our real amp. It's feeding out into a real guitar cabinet, and off we go, right? So that's the situation we want, to set our output to line out if we're going into the power amp in, and then no speaker cabinet involved in that particular scenario. Now, one other scenario I wanted to talk about is back to this sort of FRFR setup. The odd time there's going to be hybrid systems, right? Where maybe we want to send to front of house, and I've done videos on this topic as well. We want to send to front of house our modeled amp and cabinet, so that the front of house engineer just gets this great signal. But we also want to monitor on stage through, let's say, a real guitar amp. So what we can simply do with that is I could create a little space here, drag the cab over, and simply add a send block. So I can go send 1, and now what's going to happen is the guitar amp with the cab is going to flow right through this as normal and go out to our front of house, depending on how we have it set up. And we can now tap into that signal before the cabinet and send that out of send 1 into our guitar amp. Now, what setting does send 1 have to be on? That really depends. Are we going into the guitar instrument input on our amplifier? Well, then it would want to be instrument. Are we going into the effects return? Then it would want to be line input. Are we going into a power amp input? Likely going to be line input, right? And a lot of times it's as simple as just checking which one sounds the best. But so that's another scenario. You know, there's other ways to do that. We could add, a gain block here and yank it down and create a whole other path if we wanted to add different effects. And there's all sorts of options. And I did videos about this a long time ago as well. And again, we just want to make sure that whatever, we go to that end block, we set it to send 1, 2, and now that's going to be routed to a different place, just the tap off of the amp. Or maybe we want to do it after our effects, or really just depends, right, what we want to do. There's so many possibilities and scenarios. I hope that was helpful. That's a video I've wanted to do for a while, just to clear up some of the issues, because like I said, if somebody gets one of my presets that I have on Custom Toner on Marketplace that's designed, and pretty much all of them are, as FRFR use or studio use, live studio with FRFR through studio monitors, and they go try to use that in 4 cable method, it's not set up for that. It's not going to work. If they go try and use that just plugging straight into the power amp in or the effects return, even if they do their proper line or instrument setting it to line, now they've got a guitar cab on that's now feeding into another guitar cab. Maybe it's going to work, maybe it'll sound fine, but it's not going to sound as the preset was intended. And even if we use a preset designed for FRFR and use it in a situation that it wasn't designed for, it might work, but it's not going to sound as it was intended in the beginning, right? And those are all good things to keep in mind. Anyways, I hope there was some tips and tricks in there that that will help some folks and just sort of get you thinking a little bit different, and maybe just fine-tuning your settings now to bring your presets and your setup just to an optimal level. So I hope, and there's a lot of folks who already know all of this stuff, and that's fine. This video is for all those folks that ask me these questions so many times, and I really hope it was helpful and presented in a way that was clear. All right. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for all your support. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think will get use out of it. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. And I'll be back soon with some more. Ciao for now. Thanks again.